The biblical scientific creation model, which is what I'm teaching you, the parts of this that are Bible are absolutely true. The parts of it that are science could change tomorrow because they're interpretation. It's just what this model does is it takes the scientific evidence, the rocks, the fossils, carbon-14 dating, potassium-argon dating, dinosaur bones, all that stuff, and it interprets it through what the Scripture says to be true. And so with that in mind, it would tell us that God created a perfect world. There was no death with anything that had the breath of life, the nephesh. Okay, no death until after Adam and Eve sinned. That's what the Bible tells us. That sin entered creation. That was when the curse of death came on all creation. And that is when things started to die. And that is when things started to get bad. That there was a global flood around 4,500 years ago. Or about, what is that, a little close to 2,000 years after, it's 1,656 years. After, only sick people would know that. Anyway, after the creation would have been the flood, and that's assuming that Adam and Eve didn't take a long time to sin. Now I know that's an assumption, but they didn't have a child until after the curse, and they were both very biologically perfect people, so it wouldn't have taken long for them to have a child. And therefore, that's where people get that estimate. I just want you to know. And then the Ice Age, there was one Ice Age, and that the Ice Age was caused by the flood, and it was an after effect of the flood. So we do believe that there was one Ice Age. That was during the Tower of Babel. That occurred during the Ice Age. And some other really interesting things occurred then. We're only going to briefly cover that. So the Bible tells us that God created everything and that he did it in 6 real days. I'm going to use a lot of kid pictures because I think they're more fun. And I find the other pictures more boring. So you'll have to forgive me if some of them look kind of like, oh my goodness, that's from a first grade book. Kindergarten and first grade get great pictures. Anyway, and Cubby's stuff, you know, from Moana. Cubby's Moana's great stuff too. Anyway, God created in 6 days. The first 3 days, he actually created 3 canvases, and then the second 3 days, he filled in the canvases. So if you'll notice that on the left side, you've got the canvases. Day 1, if you did Cubbies, it would be day 1, day and night. Day 2, sky and water. Day 3, land and plants. Day 4, sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, fish and birds. Day 6, animals and man. Day 7, God rested. I don't know about you, but that was the easiest way I ever learned how to memorize it, so I just kept it. It's right here, you know. I had my kids all went through that, though, but okay. So the first day, and it's the only one I'm really going to hang on for any minute, but I want to just mention this to you. A lot of people don't realize this. The very first verse in the Bible actually describes the universe as we know that it exists. See, remember, the first verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, if you were an astrophysicist or you were in physics and you were studying the universe exists as a space-time matter continuum. The universe is all space. It's what we live in, right? It's all matter. Matter is the stuff in the space. And once the matter is moving through the space, you get time. That's how we define time. These 3 things actually are coexisting. They require one another to exist. If you define time, you have to have space and matter. If you define space, you have to have matter and time. If you do these things, they are coexisting. Oh, sound familiar at all? 3 parts that coexist to make up the one universe. Isn't that interesting? God created the universe in a trinity. He created the universe in a trinity. And you know what? It's not even that. God created the universe in a trinity of trinities. Time is past, present, and future. Space is width, depth, and height. And I'm not doing matter. It's too hard. But the point is that they all exist as trinities. Isn't that a trip? God created the universe in a trinity of trinities, and it's right here in the first verse. And like I said, physics-wise, we know that the universe exists as a space-time matter continuum. Watch this. In the beginning, that's where God created time. God created the heavens. That's where God created space. And the earth. That's where God created the matter. Is that a trip? First time I heard that, good old Dr. Henry Morris from the Institute for Creation Research was on a tape, and I'm listening, and I almost fell out of my car. I know where I was in Miami when I heard it, and I was like, oh my goodness, that's amazing that that's right there. And then you go on to the next verse, and the verse 2 talks about that the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the waters, okay, or vibrated or fluttereth in the King James is another way of translating that particular verb. And what we're talking about here, those of you, which some of you have already had chemistry or at least physical science, you know that what gives things their different structures in matter is their energy. It's the energy of the electrons. Remember we looked at the protons and then the electrons buzzing around out there and how many protons determine what they were and the number of electrons associated with the number of protons. So their energy levels actually are determined in there. So the second verse, we see that the Spirit of God actually is energizing his system. At this point, there was nothing wrong with the creation, but it hadn't been energized yet. We see that God makes the canvas of the universe, and the very next verse he comes in and he energizes his system. And it talks about that the Spirit of God moved over the surface of the deep. And so movement would be that energy, we believe, being put into those systems. And then the third verse talks about God creating light, which is the electromagnetic spectrum. And actually, we believe those three verses in the Bible, which I don't know about you, but you and I usually just kind of read through those and go, put them on ties. I mean, it's cool, you know, but we don't get all that out of it, right? And so the first time I heard it, I realized that second and third verse actually covers the electromagnetic spectrum, gravitational forces, the atomic forces. It covers everything we know exists as far as the space-time matter continuum we call the universe and the energy systems that are within the universe. They're just covered right there in the first three verses of the Bible. Whoa. I remember when I learned that, I was like, whoa, it's right there. Okay? So I just wanted to show you that. And then notice on the fourth day, God comes back in and paints in all the heavenly lights. He actually paints in the canvas of the universe, doesn't he? On the second day, God separated the waters above from the waters below. And I'm not going to go into any great detail there. But what did he do on the fifth day? He made all the water animals and all the winged animals. All of them, including pterosaurs. Okay, some pretty scary flying things. Some pretty scary water things. But all of the winged and water creatures were created on the fifth day because they were being painted into the canvas of what was made on the second day. On the third day, God called the land to gather together in one place and let dry land appear. Okay, so we believe the land was in one place, one big piece. And it wasn't Pangea. That was a later supercontinent. It was called Rodinia. Some of you know that already. And so when God made the land and the plants on the third day, the sixth day he came back in and painted in that canvas. He made the land critters. And then he put man in there as his grand finale. Isn't it nice to be God's grand finale? I don't know about you, but I don't feel like a grand finale most of the time. Okay? So I personally, on a regular basis, am going, Jesus, you love me. Why? Because I'm so wretched. You know, so his love is just overwhelming to me. But anyway, so I wanted you to see that there's some beautiful order there. And if we start messing with this, like the progressive creationists want to make these big, long, overlapping time periods, when you do that, you start messing with this beautiful order that God has here. That there is this canvas thing and then painting in the canvases that God made. Now, the next thing I want to deal with you really quickly is that the Word of God repeats this one phrase in Genesis 1 several times, and it's kind. Things only reproduce after they're kind. And I just want to show this to you. In 11, verse 11 in Genesis 1, when God made the trees and the plants, he said they would bear after their kind. In verse 12, they would bear seeds after their kind. And it's there twice. In verse 21, when they made the sea monsters, that they would reproduce after their kind, and that the winged creatures would reproduce after their kind. In verse 24, the land animals would reproduce after their kind, and the creeping things and beasts of the earth would reproduce after their kind. And then it's 10 times in the first chapter. 10 times it says after its or their kind. Think God's trying to make a point? Yeah. Things don't reproduce outside of kind. Now, I know some of you might think, why is she doing that? It's not a big deal. Well, it actually is, and it's because evolutionists have to believe that things change kind. And anyone that accepts evolution has to believe things change kind. Now, a lot of Christians can't explain, well, why do we see all the cool variations that we do and all these different species if God created things? Well, because when God created them, they are able to reproduce within kind. And within kind, there's a lot of variation. Within the dog kind, you can get wolves, jackals, hyenas, coyotes, dingoes, and then all of the forms of domestic dogs that we can think of. Those are all dogs, right? They don't look like cats. They don't look like cows. You know, they don't have any of that going, right? They're dogs. You can look at them and tell. And then if you were talking about the cats, have you ever watched a lion or a tiger at the zoo and thought, wow, he acts just like a cat at home? They even, you know, wind up to pounce the same way. Have you ever watched them? I've watched them and thought, oh my goodness, my cat thinks it's a panther. And so And that's all because they are actually of the original same created kind. They were related. They actually came from one kind. And you could still do a breeding chain. You could actually do a breeding chain between a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. You can't interbreed those two, can you? But you could breed the Chihuahua to a slightly larger terrier or something, and to a slightly larger dog, and that's called a breeding chain. And you could actually inbreed if you did a breeding chain, which means they come from the same original created kind. And so I just want to show you an example on the top left. That is a cross between a camel and a llama. So that's a baby comma. You like it? I think he's cute. And the guy on the right is a baby. I'm not sure if it's a liger or a tigon, and it depends on which one his mommy is and which one his daddy is, but he's a cross between a lion and a tiger. And so what we're seeing is you can get interspecies crosses, but you're not going to get crosses outside of kind. That's a wolfen. He's a cross between a pseudo-killer whale and a dolphin. And so that's called a wolfen. Some of these are pretty amazing. Within the horse kind, you can get all sorts of variation from little tiny horses, great big horses, zebras, donkeys. You can look at them and tell they're of the horse kind. That top left guy is a zonkey. That little guy on the right is one of my personal favorites because they put a Shetland pony in with a zebra thinking they couldn't have a baby, okay? And they got that, and I really like that little guy because he's got stripes and spots. I mean, now that is cool. I have paint horses at home, so I like the spots, and I thought, ooh, spots and stripes, ooh. Anyway, and so you can get a lot of variation within kind. Even little toed horses, they don't all just have to have hooves. You've heard before that there were little horses that had toes. Well, this is an article from a creation magazine, Answers magazine, that particular creation magazine, and it was about what is called baraminology. Barach is the Hebrew word for create, and it can only be used with God as its subject. So it's not for you and I to create a picture. Barach is actually where God creates something. Min is the Hebrew word for kind. So baraminology is the study of created kind. And this was an article on baraminology, and they were talking about how after the flood there were a lot of very quick changes in the horse kind, and they couldn't figure out how it could go so quickly. And if you take biology with me, I'll talk more about that, because now there's a whole study. It was called mediated design, but now we can see that happening in nutritional stuff. It's called epigenetics. We're now finding that the way we eat or the environment around us can actually trigger certain genes to be read, and if you aren't in that environment, certain genes won't be read at all. How about that noise? And so it gives us some responsibility that even if our family is full of cancer or diabetes, it doesn't mean you're going to have it. It means you have to be responsible to not turn those genes on by living a different way. And so there actually could have been environmental conditions that stimulated certain genes to be read. Okay, I'll give you an example that maybe you can relate to. You ever notice that down in, if you're not in Florida, remember we're in Florida, down in Key West and that area down in the Keys, they have little bitty deer, right? Key deer. They're like dog-sized deer. You knew that, didn't you? Oh yeah, you need to go down there. Big Pine Key and stuff like that, they have little bitty deer. They're called key deer. They're about that big. And then around here, Naples, we have deer, right? Not real big, their back's about that high. You ever seen a deer up north? They're like, on a Schwarzenegger deer, you know, bigger, you know? And then you go farther up north and they get even bigger. Well, they're all within the deer kind, but the hotter the environment, the more surface area you need to actually lose the body heat so that you're more comfortable. And the colder the environment, the less surface area you want, because you want to hold that heat in. So you know what? You get less surface area if you're bigger. You get more surface area if you're smaller. So what do we see where it's hot? Little deer. What do you see where it's cold? Big deer, you know. And so if you ever wondered, well, how do they adapt like that? Because this epigenetics, there's certain conditions that can actually stimulate certain genes to be read, and then as those things are bred in those areas, then the bigger deer, you know, will stay bigger in those areas. It's pretty neat when you think about it, isn't it?